Riverside County Superior Court falls into stunned silence as federal marshals display judicial oversight credentials, while court security freezes in recognition of the unprecedented federal intervention unfolding in Judge Patterson's courtroom. Judge William Patterson's confident authority crumbles as he recognizes the black man he'd just sentenced to life imprisonment for aggravated assault with intent to terrorize the community. The same man he dismissed as another violent criminal who deserves maximum punishment to protect law-abiding citizens. "Your Honor," District Attorney Isaiah Brooks announces, his voice carrying unmistakable prosecutorial authority throughout the packed courtroom. "I am District Attorney Isaiah Brooks of Riverside County. Some of you may not recognize me without my usual prosecutorial robes, as I have been conducting an undercover investigation into systematic racial bias in judicial sentencing." His eyes lock onto Patterson, who has gone pale. "Judge Patterson, I believe we need to discuss why you sentenced the chief prosecutor of this jurisdiction to life imprisonment based on fabricated charges, and why you told the court that defendants like this represent the kind of criminal element that threatens civilized society." The gathered courtroom freezes in recognition. The judge, who 5 minutes ago had wielded absolute judicial authority, now faces the district attorney whose investigation will expose systematic judicial racism and constitutional violations. And federal judicial misconduct charges carry mandatory removal from the bench. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra. Special for you. 96 hours earlier, District Attorney Isaiah Brooks had been reviewing alarming statistical patterns in judicial sentencing at the Riverside County District Attorney's office when he received evidence of systematic racial bias that would require the most dangerous undercover investigation of his 16-year legal career. At 42, Brooks had built his reputation on prosecutorial integrity and criminal justice reform through innovative programs that addressed both public safety and constitutional compliance, while ensuring equal treatment under law regardless of defendant demographics or socioeconomic status. His election as district attorney had been recognition of his exceptional ability to balance community safety with civil rights protection, implementing evidence-based prosecution strategies that reduced crime while eliminating the racial disparities that had characterized previous administrations. The Judge Patterson investigation had emerged from 18 months of statistical analysis, revealing systematic patterns of racially disparate sentencing that violated federal civil rights protections and constitutional equal protection requirements designed to ensure judicial fairness. Data analysis had shown that Judge Patterson consistently imposed sentences that were 340% longer for black defendants than white defendants charged with identical crimes, with documented patterns of inflammatory language and constitutional violations that suggested intentional rather than unconscious bias. What made the investigation particularly complex was evidence suggesting coordination between Patterson and certain prosecutors who provided racially coded language and charging recommendations that enabled discriminatory sentencing while maintaining plausible deniability about intentional constitutional violations. Patterson had been serving as criminal court judge for 12 years, using his position to impose systematic racial punishment that reflected personal bias rather than legal requirements, evidence quality, or legitimate sentencing guidelines established by state and federal law. His approach to criminal justice had consistently reflected white supremacist ideology, disguised as law and order conservatism, with documented patterns of treating black defendants as inherently more dangerous and morally corrupt than white defendants charged with equivalent or more serious crimes. Patterson's judicial philosophy prioritized racial control over constitutional compliance, His sentencing decisions, designed to intimidate and incapacitate black communities rather than serve legitimate justice objectives or public safety goals based on evidence and proportional punishment. The systematic bias had been enabled by institutional tolerance within Riverside County's legal system, where attorneys, court personnel, and administrative officials had observed obvious discrimination while failing to report constitutional violations that threatened judicial integrity and equal protection requirements. Chief Judge Margaret Chen had received multiple complaints about Patterson's discriminatory sentencing patterns, but had treated civil rights violations as administrative personnel issues rather than constitutional crises requiring immediate federal intervention and judicial accountability. Judge Patterson demonstrates concerning patterns of disparate sentencing that require administrative review and additional sensitivity training. Chen had written in personnel files that documented but failed to address systematic constitutional violations. The institutional tolerance for judicial racism had enabled Patterson's bias to flourish while creating hostile environment for minority defendants and undermining public confidence in judicial fairness that democratic institutions required for legitimacy and community support. Brooks's decision to conduct personal undercover investigation rather than relying on statistical analysis and witness testimony had been motivated by recognition that prosecuting judicial misconduct required documented evidence of systematic bias that could withstand legal challenges and appellate review. His cover identity as Isaiah Johnson, a community activist arrested during protest activity, had been carefully constructed to provide believable criminal charges while allowing direct observation of Patterson's judicial conduct and discriminatory decision-making processes. Federal coordination had been essential due to constitutional implications of judicial bias and civil rights violations that exceeded state jurisdiction and required federal civil rights enforcement under Department of Justice oversight and Constitutional Protection Authority. Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Cole had been coordinating with federal civil rights prosecutors while maintaining operational security that prevented Patterson and potentially compromised court personnel from learning about ongoing investigation into systematic judicial misconduct. Brooks's undercover operation is essential for documenting judicial bias that occurs during closed proceedings and private judicial decision-making, Cole had briefed federal coordination teams. Statistical evidence requires individual case documentation that proves intentional rather than accidental discrimination. The federal cooperation had been necessary because judicial immunity protections required extraordinary evidence of intentional constitutional violations before judges could face criminal prosecution or removal from office through federal civil rights enforcement. Edia Michael Torres had been monitoring Patterson's cases while documenting patterns of discriminatory language, disparate sentencing, and constitutional violations that would support federal prosecution under civil rights statutes designed to address judicial misconduct. Patterson's sentencing demonstrates systematic racial bias that violates federal civil rights protections and constitutional equal protection requirements, Torres had reported to Brooks during weekly coordination meetings. Thomas Reed, Brooks's chief of staff, had been coordinating with state and federal oversight agencies while ensuring that evidence collection would support comprehensive prosecution of judicial misconduct, rather than administrative sanctions that might protect Patterson from serious accountability. This investigation will establish precedent for prosecuting judicial racism as federal civil rights violation rather than administrative personnel issue, Reed had informed State Attorney General coordination meetings. Court reporter Sandra Wilson had been documenting Patterson's discriminatory language and constitutional violations while maintaining professional objectivity that would ensure her testimony could support federal prosecution of systematic judicial bias and equal protection violations. As Brooks had prepared for his undercover appearance in Patterson's courtroom, he understood that successful prosecution would require documentation of systematic constitutional violations and racial bias that exceeded occasional poor judgment. To demonstrate intentional civil rights violations requiring federal judicial accountability. The investigation was designed to transform statistical evidence of racial bias into documented proof of systematic constitutional violations that would support federal prosecution while protecting future defendants from judicial racism that threatened equal protection and democratic justice. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. District Attorney Isaiah Brooks entered Riverside County Superior Court at 9 a.m., maintaining his cover identity as Isaiah Johnson, while facing fabricated charges that had been carefully constructed to test Judge Patterson's documented patterns of racial bias and discriminatory sentencing practices. The courtroom atmosphere reflected institutional formality designed to project justice and constitutional compliance. But Brooks's prosecutorial experience immediately identified concerning patterns in court personnel behavior and judicial procedures that suggested systematic bias rather than equal treatment under law. His appearance had been carefully designed to trigger Patterson's documented racial stereotypes, casual clothing that suggested economic disadvantage, and demeanor that would elicit the discriminatory treatment that federal investigation was designed to document and prosecute. Judge Patterson entered the courtroom with authoritative bearing that reflected confidence in his ability to impose personal racial bias through judicial power while maintaining appearance of legal legitimacy and constitutional compliance. Case number 2024 CR 3847, People vs. Isaiah Johnson. Court Clerk Pierce announced, reading charges that had been coordinated between Brooks's investigation team and federal prosecutors to create circumstances requiring judicial decision-making that would reveal Patterson's systematic bias. Patterson immediately focused on Brooks with obvious hostility that exceeded appropriate judicial demeanor, his facial expressions and body language revealing racial animus, rather than professional judicial assessment of legal proceedings and evidence evaluation. Mr. Johnson, you are charged with aggravated assault, disturbing the peace, and resisting arrest during illegal protest activity, Patterson stated, his tone carrying condescension and presumption of guilt that violated due process requirements and judicial neutrality standards. Brooks maintained his cover identity while internally cataloging constitutional violations and judicial misconduct that exceeded documented patterns to demonstrate active racial bias. Your Honor, I respectfully request court-appointed counsel to represent me during these proceedings. His request for legal representation was constitutionally guaranteed and procedurally appropriate, but Patterson's response revealed obvious irritation with due process requirements that interfered with predetermined sentencing objectives based on racial characteristics rather than legal evidence. Mr. Johnson, given the serious nature of these charges and your obvious threat to community safety, I'm denying bail and remanding you to custody pending trial, Patterson announced without reviewing evidence, witness statements, or legal precedents that should guide judicial decision-making. The denial of bail without evidentiary justification violated constitutional requirements and established legal standards while demonstrating exactly the kind of discriminatory treatment that federal investigation was designed to document and prosecute. Public Defender Martinez attempted to provide constitutional advocacy. Your Honor, Mr. Johnson has no prior criminal record and strong community ties. denial of bail appears disproportionate to the charges and violates constitutional requirements for individualized assessment. Patterson's response to legal advocacy revealed hostility toward constitutional protections. Counselor, this defendant represents exactly the kind of criminal element that threatens law-abiding citizens. Community safety requires maximum judicial response to violent behavior and antisocial activity. The characterization of protest activity as violent behavior while ignoring constitutional rights demonstrated exactly the discriminatory judicial rhetoric that statistical analysis had identified as systematic pattern requiring federal prosecution. Adia Foster, who was unknowingly participating in the investigation, presented routine prosecutorial evidence, while Patterson's reactions revealed predetermined conclusions based on racial bias rather than legal evidence or constitutional requirements. Your Honor, the defendant was arrested during protest activity that disrupted public order, Foster stated, providing factual information that should prompt judicial evaluation rather than predetermined sentencing based on racial characteristics. Patterson's response revealed systematic bias. Counselor, individuals who engage in this type of antisocial behavior demonstrate fundamental disrespect for law and order that requires maximum judicial response to protect civilized society from criminal elements. The inflammatory language, while prejudging guilt, violated judicial ethics and constitutional due process requirements that federal oversight was designed to identify and prosecute through civil rights enforcement. Court reporter Wilson documented Patterson's discriminatory language while recognizing obvious constitutional violations that exceeded normal judicial discretion to demonstrate intentional racial bias requiring federal intervention and judicial accountability. Pastor Johnson, observing from public seating, recognized systematic discrimination that reflected broader patterns of institutional racism affecting community members. Judge Patterson is demonstrating obvious racial bias that violates constitutional protections and judicial ethics. His community perspective provided additional witness testimony about systematic patterns affecting multiple defendants, while confirming that Patterson's bias was visible to public observers and community members. Mrs. Hernandez, a regular court observer, documented Patterson's discriminatory treatment while comparing his behavior toward white and black defendants. Judge Patterson treats black defendants completely differently, using inflammatory language and imposing excessive sentences that white defendants never receive. A systematic observation provided crucial evidence of discriminatory patterns that supported statistical analysis with individual case documentation required for federal prosecution of judicial misconduct and civil rights violations. As Patterson escalated discriminatory language while ignoring constitutional protections and due process requirements, Brooks understood that maintaining cover while documenting systematic bias was providing exactly the evidence federal prosecution required. For comprehensive judicial accountability, the investigation had captured Patterson's racial bias in action, while demonstrating systematic constitutional violations that exceeded statistical patterns to provide documented proof of intentional discrimination requiring immediate federal intervention and judicial removal. Patterson's courtroom behavior was confirming federal intelligence about systematic judicial racism while providing evidence that would support comprehensive prosecution under civil rights statutes designed to address institutional discrimination and constitutional violations by government officials. Judge Patterson's discriminatory treatment of Isaiah Johnson escalated beyond routine judicial bias to systematic constitutional violations that demonstrated intentional racial animus requiring immediate federal intervention to protect both due process rights and broader judicial integrity. Mr. Johnson, Your pattern of antisocial behavior and criminal activity represents exactly the kind of threat that requires maximum judicial response," Patterson declared while reviewing fabricated charges that should have prompted routine plea negotiations rather than inflammatory judicial commentary about defendant character. Brooks maintained his cover identity while documenting Patterson's violation of judicial neutrality requirements and constitutional due process protections that prohibited prejudicial statements and predetermined guilt assessments before evidence presentation and legal argument. "Your Honor, I respectfully maintain my innocence and request fair treatment under constitutional law," Brooks stated calmly, his response designed to elicit additional discriminatory treatment that would support federal prosecution while maintaining operational security. Patterson's reaction to reasonable legal requests revealed systematic hostility toward constitutional protections. "Mr. Johnson, your attitude demonstrates exactly the kind of disrespect for legal authority that characterizes criminal elements threatening community safety and social order." The characterization of constitutional rights as disrespect for legal authority, while treating due process as optional rather than mandatory, demonstrated exactly the judicial misconduct that federal civil rights enforcement was designed to address and prosecute. Public Defender Martinez escalated constitutional advocacy despite obvious judicial hostility. "Your Honor, Mr. Johnson is entitled to presumption of innocence and individualized sentencing based on evidence rather than inflammatory characterizations that violate judicial ethics and constitutional requirements." Patterson's response to constitutional argument revealed institutional arrogance about judicial accountability. "Counselor, this court determines appropriate judicial response based on community safety rather than technical legal arguments that ignore practical realities of criminal behavior and social responsibility." His dismissal of constitutional protections as technical legal arguments, while claiming authority to ignore due process requirements, confirmed systematic judicial misconduct that exceeded poor judgment to demonstrate intentional civil rights violations. Attorney Davis, observing from public seating as civil rights monitor, began documenting Patterson's constitutional violations for potential federal prosecution. Judge Patterson is systematically violating due process while demonstrating obvious racial bias that requires immediate federal intervention. His legal expertise confirmed that Patterson's behavior exceeded normal judicial discretion while violating federal civil rights protections and constitutional requirements that government officials were sworn to protect rather than violate. Ada Foster attempted to provide routine prosecutorial presentation, while Patterson's interruptions revealed predetermined conclusions based on racial stereotypes rather than evidence evaluation. "Your Honor, the prosecution respectfully requests opportunity to present evidence before judicial determination of appropriate sentencing." Patterson's response revealed impatience with constitutional procedures. "Counselor, the evidence is obvious from defendant's behavior and attitude. This court doesn't require extended proceedings when criminal activity and social threat are apparent from defendant characteristics and criminal history." The claim that criminal activity was apparent from defendant characteristics, while ignoring actual evidence, demonstrated exactly the racial bias that statistical analysis had identified as systematic pattern requiring federal prosecution. Reporter Parker, documenting court proceedings for potential media coverage, observed obvious constitutional violations. Judge Patterson is demonstrating systematic bias that violates judicial ethics and constitutional protections while treating this defendant completely differently than white defendants with equivalent charges. His journalism perspective provided additional documentation of discriminatory treatment while ensuring public accountability would complement federal prosecution of systematic judicial misconduct and civil rights violations. Chief Judge Chen, who had been notified about unusual judicial behavior, entered the courtroom to observe Patterson's conduct while recognizing obvious constitutional violations that required immediate administrative intervention and potential federal notification. "Judge Patterson, I'm observing today's proceedings as part of routine judicial oversight," Chen announced. Her presence intended to moderate Patterson's behavior while documenting systematic constitutional violations. Patterson's response to judicial oversight revealed defensive hostility. Chief Judge Chen, this court operates according to established legal procedures that ensure community safety and appropriate judicial response to criminal behavior that threatens social order. His characterization of constitutional violations as established legal procedures, while claiming community safety justification for racial bias, demonstrated systematic judicial misconduct that required federal intervention rather than administrative correction. Ms. Rodriguez, community activist observing court proceedings, recognized systematic discrimination affecting minority defendants. Judge Patterson consistently treats black defendants with hostility and bias while providing white defendants with constitutional protections and fair judicial treatment. Her community perspective provided additional evidence of systematic patterns affecting multiple families, while confirming that Patterson's racism was visible to community observers and civil rights advocates. Court reporter Wilson continued, documenting Patterson's discriminatory language while recognizing unprecedented constitutional violations that exceeded normal judicial misconduct to demonstrate intentional racial bias requiring federal prosecution and judicial removal. As Patterson prepared to impose sentence based on racial characteristics rather than legal evidence or constitutional requirements, Brooks understood that revealing his actual identity was becoming necessary to prevent completion of systematic constitutional violations while ensuring federal accountability. The investigation had documented systematic judicial racism while providing evidence that Patterson's bias threatened not only individual constitutional rights but broader judicial integrity and equal protection requirements that democratic institutions required for legitimacy and public confidence. Patterson's escalating constitutional violations were confirming federal intelligence about systematic judicial bias, while creating exactly the documented evidence that federal prosecution required for comprehensive accountability and judicial removal under civil rights statutes. While Judge Patterson escalated his discriminatory treatment of Isaiah Johnson in Riverside County Superior Court, comprehensive federal and state oversight systems were rapidly detecting judicial misconduct patterns that would trigger the largest civil rights investigation into judicial bias in state history. Chief Judge Margaret Chen had been monitoring Patterson's sentencing patterns through statistical analysis systems that identified judicial misconduct and constitutional violations requiring immediate administrative intervention and potential federal notification about systematic civil rights abuse. Judge Patterson's sentencing data shows unprecedented racial disparities that exceed statistical margins for unconscious bias and suggest intentional constitutional violations, Chen reported to State Administrative Office via secure judicial oversight communication. The statistical evidence had been accumulating for months, while administrative systems failed to address obvious patterns that federal oversight was designed to identify and prosecute through civil rights enforcement mechanisms. State Attorney General Patricia Williams was reviewing judicial misconduct reports as part of broader civil rights compliance monitoring that examined institutional racism in state government agencies and constitutional violations by elected officials. Riverside County judicial operations show systematic patterns of racial bias affecting sentencing, bail decisions, and constitutional protections. Williams reported to federal coordination meetings. Judge Patterson's misconduct appears to violate federal civil rights statutes requiring Department of Justice intervention. Federal civil rights monitoring had been tracking state judicial systems for constitutional compliance while documenting systematic violations that required federal prosecution rather than state administrative correction that might protect institutional racism. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division was analyzing judicial bias patterns nationwide while coordinating with local civil rights organizations about systematic constitutional violations affecting minority communities and democratic institution integrity. Judicial racial bias represents systematic threat to constitutional government when courts violate rather than protect equal protection requirements. DOJ Civil Rights Coordinator informed federal oversight teams. Federal prosecution frameworks were being prepared that would address both individual judicial misconduct and institutional patterns that enabled systematic constitutional violations affecting democratic legitimacy and civil rights compliance. FBI Civil Rights Division was conducting surveillance of judicial proceedings while documenting constitutional violations and gathering evidence that would support federal prosecution under civil rights statutes designed to address government official misconduct. Judge Patterson's courtroom behavior demonstrates systematic racial bias that violates federal civil rights protections and constitutional equal protection requirements. Agent Martinez reported to Federal Investigation Coordination. The federal evidence collection was confirming Brooks's undercover investigation while providing additional documentation that would support comprehensive prosecution of judicial misconduct and institutional accountability. Meanwhile, investigative reporter James Parker had been researching judicial bias patterns as part of comprehensive journalism project examining institutional racism in state government and constitutional violations by elected officials. Judge Patterson appears in multiple complaint databases for discriminatory sentencing and constitutional violations affecting minority defendants, Parker reported to his news organization. Statistical analysis suggests systematic rather than occasional bias requiring federal investigation. His journalism was preparing public accountability measures that would complement federal prosecution while ensuring community awareness of systematic constitutional violations requiring comprehensive reform rather than administrative correction. NAACP Legal Defense Fund was documenting judicial bias affecting minority communities while coordinating with federal civil rights prosecutors about systematic constitutional violations requiring immediate intervention and judicial accountability. Judge Patterson's systematic discrimination affects dozens of families while demonstrating institutional racism that threatens equal protection and democratic justice, Attorney Beverly Foster told Civil Rights Coordination meetings. The civil rights framework was elevating individual cases to systematic institutional analysis that examined structural racism and federal accountability requirements for constitutional compliance and democratic governance. Congressional Representative Maria Santos, who served on House Judiciary Committee, had been reviewing federal oversight of state judicial systems and constitutional compliance requirements for government officials. Judicial bias represents systematic threat to democratic institutions when courts violate rather than protect constitutional rights, Santos stated during congressional briefing about federal civil rights enforcement. Congressional oversight was preparing legislative accountability that would complement federal prosecution while ensuring systematic judicial reform rather than individual punishment that ignored institutional problems. Community advocacy organizations were coordinating legal assistance while documenting systematic judicial bias affecting multiple families and communities throughout the region. Patterson's discrimination represents systematic judicial violence that terrorizes minority communities while violating constitutional protections. Civil rights advocate Angela Rodriguez told community coordination meetings. Community documentation was providing additional evidence of systematic patterns while ensuring that federal prosecution addressed broader constitutional compliance rather than individual criminal behavior. Law enforcement oversight agencies were monitoring judicial cooperation with criminal justice objectives while documenting constitutional violations that compromised legitimate law enforcement and community safety goals. Judicial bias undermines legitimate criminal justice by violating constitutional protections that ensure public confidence in legal system integrity, Law Enforcement Oversight Coordinator reported. Federal intelligence agencies were analyzing institutional racism patterns while coordinating with civil rights prosecutors about systematic constitutional violations that threatened democratic institution integrity and national security through governmental constitutional non-compliance. Systematic judicial bias represents institutional threat to constitutional government and democratic legitimacy, Federal Intelligence Analysis reported. As multiple oversight systems documented Patterson's constitutional violations, while Brooks continued his undercover investigation, comprehensive federal accountability was developing that would address both individual judicial misconduct and systematic institutional racism. The convergence of statistical evidence, individual case documentation, community testimony, and federal oversight was creating comprehensive prosecution framework that would ensure judicial accountability while protecting democratic institution integrity through constitutional compliance enforcement. Brooks's undercover investigation was occurring within complex oversight systems designed to protect both individual constitutional rights and broader democratic institutions. But Patterson's systematic bias had triggered exactly the kind of federal intervention that civil rights enforcement was designed to provide when state systems failed to ensure constitutional compliance. District Attorney Isaiah Brooks stood in Judge Patterson's courtroom as the discriminatory sentencing reached the threshold, requiring immediate revelation of prosecutorial authority to protect both constitutional compliance and judicial integrity. While federal response teams prepared coordinated intervention, Patterson's systematic bias had escalated beyond routine judicial misconduct to intentional constitutional violations that threatened both individual due process rights and broader democratic institution integrity that federal oversight was designed to protect and enforce. Judge Patterson, your systematic violation of constitutional due process and equal protection requirements has exceeded judicial misconduct and now constitutes federal civil rights violations, Brooks stated, his tone beginning to carry prosecutorial authority that suggested legal expertise beyond typical defendant representation. Patterson's response revealed increasing defensiveness about judicial accountability. Mr. Johnson, defendants don't lecture this court about constitutional law or judicial procedures. Criminal elements don't possess authority to question legitimate judicial decision-making based on evidence and community safety requirements. His continued constitutional violations, despite obvious legal expertise from the defendant, demonstrated systematic judicial arrogance that exceeded poor judgment to confirm intentional discrimination, requiring federal intervention rather than administrative correction. Brooks activated discreet emergency communication that would trigger immediate federal judicial oversight while continuing to document Patterson's civil rights violations and constitutional misconduct for federal prosecution evidence. State Attorney General Williams received priority alert and authorized immediate judicial oversight intervention. District Attorney Brooks' situation requires comprehensive state and federal response. Patterson's constitutional violations threaten both individual due process and broader judicial integrity. Full authority for immediate intervention and federal coordination. Federal coordination teams positioned throughout Riverside County received authorization for intervention designed to protect constitutional compliance while ensuring systematic judicial misconduct faced federal prosecution rather than administrative protection. Chief Judge Chen entered the courtroom with obvious concern about constitutional violations. Judge Patterson, I've been monitoring today's proceedings and observing concerning patterns that require immediate judicial oversight and potential federal notification about constitutional compliance. Patterson's response to judicial oversight revealed institutional hostility. Chief Judge Chen, this court operates according to established judicial procedures that ensure appropriate response to criminal behavior. Administrative oversight doesn't override judicial authority over sentencing and constitutional interpretation. His characterization of constitutional violations as established judicial procedures, while claiming authority to override constitutional protections, demonstrated exactly the systematic misconduct that federal judicial oversight was designed to identify and prosecute. Attorney Davis approached with legal documentation of constitutional violations. Judge Patterson, you are systematically violating federal constitutional protections and due process requirements. This defendant's treatment demonstrates judicial bias that requires immediate federal intervention and civil rights investigation. Patterson's response to legal challenge revealed entrenched bias. Attorney Davis, civil rights lawyers don't understand judicial authority or criminal justice requirements. Constitutional technicalities don't override community safety and appropriate judicial response to criminal elements. The dismissal of constitutional protections as technicalities while claiming judicial authority to violate due process confirmed systematic judicial misconduct that exceeded administrative concerns to require federal prosecution under civil rights statutes. At 10:47 a.m., federal judicial oversight teams executed coordinated intervention through administrative and civil rights channels while displaying federal authority that immediately transformed judicial misconduct into accountability for systematic constitutional violations. Federal judicial oversight intervention. Everyone remain calm and cooperate with constitutional compliance investigation. Federal Inspector Chen announced, while leading DOJ civil rights enforcement through courtroom federal authority, immediately challenging Patterson's discriminatory treatment. Patterson's shock at federal intervention was evident as he recognized that his constitutional violations were being documented by authorities whose jurisdiction exceeded state judicial protection and administrative discretion. Inspector Chen, this appears to be federal overreach regarding state judicial authority, Patterson stammered while attempting to minimize constitutional violations. Local judicial operations require professional discretion that federal oversight might not fully understand or appreciate. Inspector Chen's response eliminated any possibility of hiding behind jurisdictional claims. Judge Patterson, systematic constitutional violations and civil rights abuse constitute federal crimes regardless of your state judicial authority. Federal officials are sworn to protect constitutional rights rather than enable government violations. Attorney General Williams provided state authority that supported federal intervention. Judge Patterson, systematic violation of constitutional due process and equal protection requirements exceeds state judicial authority while triggering mandatory federal civil rights investigation under Department of Justice oversight. The federal and state coordination made clear that constitutional violations had triggered comprehensive accountability that judicial immunity couldn't prevent when systematic bias violated federal civil rights protections and democratic institution requirements. Federal Prosecutor Liu announced federal jurisdiction over constitutional violations. Judge Patterson, systematic discrimination and due process violations constitute federal crimes under civil rights statutes. Judicial authority doesn't include constitutional violation or equal protection abuse. As federal oversight teams secured evidence of systematic constitutional violations while protecting individual due process rights, Patterson understood that his judicial protection had evaporated and that his constitutional violations would face federal accountability. Brooks understood that revealing prosecutorial authority was necessary to prevent completion of systematic constitutional violations while ensuring federal accountability that state administrative systems had failed to provide. Judge Patterson, Brooks announced with prosecutorial authority, "I am District Attorney Isaiah Brooks of Riverside County. Your systematic constitutional violations during my undercover investigation have triggered comprehensive federal civil rights prosecution under my coordination with Department of Justice oversight." The revelation of actual prosecutorial authority eliminated any possibility of continued constitutional violations, while demonstrating that judicial bias had been observed by Chief Prosecutor whose institutional authority would ensure comprehensive federal accountability rather than administrative protection. Federal intervention had demonstrated that constitutional violations by government officials triggered immediate federal accountability when systematic bias threatened both individual rights and broader democratic institution integrity through judicial misconduct and civil rights abuse. Riverside County Superior Court became the epicenter of a judicial revelation that would expose systematic constitutional violations, while demonstrating how quickly judicial immunity could collapse when civil rights abuse attracted direct federal intervention at the highest prosecutorial levels. Judge William Patterson, District Attorney Brooks announced, his voice now carrying unmistakable prosecutorial authority throughout the stunned courtroom. "I am District Attorney Isaiah Brooks of Riverside County. For the past 4 days, you have subjected the Chief Prosecutor of this jurisdiction to systematic constitutional violations, racial bias, and due process abuse during an undercover investigation into judicial misconduct." Patterson stood paralyzed as the full implications of his actions became clear. The man he had sentenced to life imprisonment while using racially inflammatory language was actually the district attorney whose prosecutorial authority would ensure criminal accountability rather than judicial immunity protection. "District Attorney Brooks, I had no way of knowing your actual prosecutorial status," Patterson stammered, his judicial confidence dissolving as he recognized that his constitutional violations had been directed against someone whose authority far exceeded judicial protection. "If I had known you were the district attorney, I would never have treated you with anything less than complete professional respect." Brooks's response eliminated any possibility of hiding behind ignorance about prosecutorial identity. "Judge Patterson, my actual position is irrelevant to the fact that you systematically violate constitutional rights, demonstrate racial bias, and abuse judicial authority against minority defendants. Your behavior would have been equally unconstitutional if directed against any citizen appearing before this court." The distinction between failing to recognize prosecutorial authority and systematically violating constitutional protections made Patterson's judicial conduct indefensible under any legal or ethical standard. Chief Judge Chen stepped forward with immediate judicial accountability. Judge William Patterson, you are suspended from judicial duties pending federal investigation for systematic constitutional violations, civil rights abuse, and judicial misconduct. Your behavior constitutes grounds for immediate removal and potential criminal prosecution. State Attorney General Williams, realizing that federal oversight had documented systematic judicial racism, announced comprehensive investigation. District Attorney Brooks, the state of California will coordinate with federal prosecutors to ensure complete accountability for judicial constitutional violations. Judge Patterson's systematic bias represents institutional failure requiring comprehensive reform. Federal Inspector Chen's response revealed the scope of federal evidence. Attorney General Williams, federal monitoring shows systematic patterns of constitutional violations affecting dozens of defendants over multiple years. Patterson's judicial misconduct constitutes federal crimes under civil rights statutes requiring Department of Justice prosecution. The systematic constitutional violation charges made clear that Patterson's individual racism reflected broader judicial accountability problems requiring federal intervention rather than state administrative correction. Attorney Davis, who had documented Patterson's discriminatory treatment, provided additional evidence to federal investigators. District Attorney Brooks, I recorded Judge Patterson's systematic constitutional violations and witnessed identical bias against multiple minority defendants. His behavior represents institutional pattern rather than individual poor judgment. His legal documentation revealed systematic civil rights abuse while demonstrating community impact beyond individual case constitutional violations. Court reporter Wilson, whose documentation had been crucial for exposing Patterson's bias, approached federal authorities with comprehensive evidence. District Attorney Brooks, I documented Judge Patterson's discriminatory language and constitutional violations, affecting dozens of cases over 2 years. This represents systematic judicial misconduct rather than occasional bias. Her professional testimony provided crucial insider evidence of systematic constitutional violations, while demonstrating institutional enabling through administrative tolerance. Federal Prosecutor Liu announced comprehensive federal charges as evidence teams secured documentation of systematic judicial misconduct. William Patterson, you are under federal investigation for conspiracy to violate civil rights, systematic, constitutional abuse, and judicial misconduct under color of law. Additional charges will follow as investigation expands to examine institutional patterns. The federal prosecution demonstrated that constitutional violations by government officials encompass systematic accountability rather than individual punishment, ensuring comprehensive civil rights enforcement. Pastor Johnson, representing affected community members, addressed federal investigators about broader accountability. District Attorney Brooks, Judge Patterson's systematic bias terrorized our community while violating constitutional protections. Federal prosecution should address institutional racism rather than individual judicial misconduct. Community perspective provided crucial context about systematic institutional violence that affected not only individual defendants, but broader civil rights compliance and democratic institution integrity. Mrs. Hernandez, whose court observation had documented Patterson's discriminatory patterns, provided witness testimony. District Attorney Brooks, Judge Patterson treated minority defendants with obvious hostility while providing white defendants with constitutional protections and fair judicial treatment. This represents years of systematic bias. Her documentation confirmed systematic discrimination affecting multiple families while validating statistical evidence with individual case observations. Patterson made final attempt to minimize constitutional liability, District Attorney Brooks, if my judicial decisions appear to demonstrate bias that reflects emphasis on community safety rather than intentional constitutional violations. Judicial discretion sometimes requires firm responses that civil rights investigators might interpret as discriminatory. Brooks's response was definitive. Judge Patterson, you systematically violated constitutional due process, demonstrated racial bias, and abused judicial authority while creating hostile courtroom environment based on defendant race rather than legal evidence. Your behavior constitutes serious federal crimes that judicial discretion neither requires nor justifies. As federal investigators completed evidence collection while documenting systematic constitutional violations, the transformation was complete. The judicial system that had operated through systematic racism now faced comprehensive federal prosecution under the authority of the district attorney whose constitutional rights had been violated by the same discrimination that affected countless defendants. The judge who had dismissed constitutional protections as irrelevant technicalities now faced federal prosecution that would expose systematic judicial bias to accountability that judicial immunity couldn't prevent and administrative protection couldn't influence. Brooks understood that exposing Patterson's constitutional violations had revealed systematic institutional problems requiring comprehensive federal intervention rather than individual judicial discipline, ensuring that civil rights abuse and judicial misconduct would face federal accountability that served constitutional compliance rather than institutional convenience. The morning following District Attorney Brooks's revelation triggered comprehensive federal intervention that transformed systematic judicial racism from protected institutional practice to federal criminal prosecution, while establishing unprecedented accountability standards for constitutional compliance in state court systems. Within 12 hours of Patterson's suspension, U.S. Attorney General Patricia Williams announced formal federal investigation into judicial civil rights compliance nationwide, recognizing that constitutional violations and systematic racism represented broader institutional problems requiring federal accountability rather than state administrative correction. Judge Patterson's systematic constitutional violations against District Attorney Brooks demonstrate institutional judicial racism that affects not only individual defendants, but broader democratic institution integrity when courts violate rather than protect constitutional rights, Williams announced during federal press conference. District Attorney Brooks personally addressed judicial accountability during congressional testimony that would establish federal standards for constitutional compliance and civil rights enforcement in state judicial systems. Patterson's systematic bias represents institutional judicial racism that threatens both individual constitutional protections and broader democratic legitimacy when government officials violate rather than defend the constitutional rights they are sworn to protect, Brooks told House Judiciary Committee. His testimony elevated individual judicial misconduct to systematic institutional analysis that examined structural racism and federal accountability requirements for constitutional compliance in democratic institutions. Congressional Representative Santos announced legislative oversight during hearings focused on federal judicial accountability and constitutional compliance enforcement. Judicial constitutional violations represent systematic threats to democratic institutions when courts enable rather than prevent government civil rights abuse. Federal accountability measures were implemented immediately. Mandatory federal oversight for judicial constitutional compliance, automatic federal prosecution triggered by systematic bias, enhanced civil rights monitoring systems, and federal funding tied to constitutional compliance rather than administrative convenience. Judge Patterson was convicted of federal civil rights violations and sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. The first state judge prosecuted under federal civil rights statutes for systematic constitutional violations, establishing precedent that judicial racism carried serious federal consequences. William Patterson systematically violated constitutional rights while abusing judicial authority that threatened democratic institution integrity and individual civil rights protection, federal judge stated during sentencing. Judicial constitutional violations demand maximum federal punishment that protects future defendants from government civil rights abuse. Chief Judge Chen underwent federal investigation for enabling constitutional violations and was removed from administrative position, her failure to address systematic judicial racism demonstrating institutional accountability beyond individual misconduct. Riverside County Superior Court underwent complete federal restructuring under Department of Justice oversight. New judicial leadership, comprehensive constitutional compliance training, community oversight participation, and federal monitoring, ensuring civil rights protection while maintaining legitimate judicial effectiveness. Federal oversight included establishment of Judicial Accountability Fund, totaling $47 million distributed among defendants affected by systematic constitutional violations, providing compensation for civil rights abuse, legal assistance, and community programs addressing institutional racism and democratic institution reform. Pastor Johnson was appointed to Federal Judicial Oversight Board, ensuring that reform addressed community priorities rather than administrative convenience. Federal accountability must serve constitutional compliance and institutional reform that prevents future judicial civil rights abuse rather than simply punishing individual misconduct. His voice in oversight ensured that federal intervention addressed systematic institutional problems rather than focusing exclusively on individual criminal prosecution. Community healing programs addressed trauma caused by systematic judicial racism and government constitutional violations. Judicial civil rights abuse creates institutional trauma affecting entire communities. Federal accountability must include community healing and institutional reform that rebuilds trust in democratic institutions. Community healing required addressing not only individual constitutional violations, but collective trauma caused by systematic government betrayal that had made courts sources of oppression rather than constitutional protection for minority communities. Federal Emergency Management Agency announced judicial recovery assistance, recognizing that systematic constitutional violations constituted democratic disaster, requiring comprehensive federal support for institutional rebuilding and constitutional restoration. Judicial constitutional violations represent democratic disasters requiring federal intervention for constitutional restoration and institutional reform, FEMA coordinator announced. Federal resources will support victim assistance, judicial reform, and community healing programs. Attorney Davis announced comprehensive civil rights litigation representing affected defendants. We're filing federal lawsuits seeking damages for systematic constitutional violations affecting hundreds of defendants over multiple years. Federal compensation will address institutional harm while ensuring comprehensive judicial reform. The civil litigation provided additional accountability beyond criminal prosecution, while ensuring that systematic constitutional violations resulted in financial consequences that motivated institutional reform rather than administrative tolerance. Federal Bureau of Investigation announced enhanced judicial monitoring protocols requiring systematic constitutional compliance review and automatic federal prosecution when courts demonstrated bias or constitutional violations that threatened civil rights protection. Constitutional compliance requires judicial systems that protect rather than violate civil rights, FBI Judicial Oversight Coordinator announced. Federal monitoring ensures that courts serve rather than abuse constitutional protections. The systematic reform process concluded with permanent federal monitoring, statistical analysis of judicial constitutional compliance, community oversight with federal authority, automatic federal prosecution triggered by systematic bias, and congressional oversight ensuring sustained constitutional compliance. Data analysis 18 months after federal intervention showed remarkable improvements. Constitutional violations by judges decreased by 98%, minority defendant satisfaction with judicial treatment increased dramatically, and legitimate judicial effectiveness increased as constitutional compliance enhanced rather than hindered fair legal proceedings. Constitutional compliance enhanced rather than compromised legitimate judicial effectiveness, federal oversight reported. Professional constitutional adjudication provides better democratic institution integrity than systematic bias while protecting civil rights that courts are sworn to defend. The accountability process established permanent federal monitoring, ensuring that judicial constitutional compliance would be sustained through federal oversight rather than reverting to state administrative tolerance that had enabled systematic civil rights violations and democratic institution abuse. District Attorney Brooks's experience had catalyzed comprehensive reform, demonstrating that government officials face serious consequences for constitutional violations, while establishing systems ensuring future civil rights compliance in judicial operations nationwide. Over the following 30 months, Riverside County's judicial system underwent the most comprehensive constitutional transformation in state history, implementing changes that served as a national model for eliminating systematic judicial racism, while enhancing legitimate constitutional compliance through democratic accountability and civil rights protection. The Federal Judicial Constitutional Compliance Commission, established under Department of Justice authority, was directed by former federal judge Dr. Patricia Martinez, whose expertise in civil rights law and constitutional enforcement made her uniquely qualified to rebuild judicial systems that had systematically violated constitutional protections while compromising democratic institution integrity. "We're not just removing biased judges," Dr. Martinez explained during mandatory training attended by all 127 Riverside County judicial personnel and 890 statewide court officials. "We're building constitutional judicial systems that protect civil rights through equal treatment rather than systematic racism that violates constitutional protections and democratic legitimacy." The comprehensive training emphasized constitutional adjudication, equal protection enforcement, and civil rights compliance rather than racial bias, discriminatory sentencing, and systematic constitutional violations that had characterized institutional judicial misconduct. Chief Judge Margaret Chen, appointed through federal oversight process after comprehensive constitutional compliance review, implemented revolutionary accountability measures throughout judicial operations. Every sentencing decision was now federally monitored, with monthly statistical analysis showing demographic patterns and constitutional compliance assessment that ensured equal treatment rather than systematic discrimination. Democratic justice requires constitutional judicial systems that protect civil rights rather than enabling government racism, Chen explained to Federal Oversight Board. Professional constitutional adjudication based on legal evidence rather than racial bias provides more effective democratic institution integrity while ensuring equal protection compliance. The accountability framework made systematic constitutional violations organizationally impossible to sustain while ensuring that legitimate judicial authority could effectively serve constitutional protection through equal treatment rather than discriminatory enforcement. District Attorney Brooks worked with Department of Justice constitutional experts to develop the Riverside Protocol, comprehensive procedures for identifying and addressing judicial racism before it escalated to systematic constitutional violations requiring federal prosecution. Judicial systems wield fundamental authority over constitutional rights and must operate through civil rights compliance rather than institutional racism, Brooks explained during congressional testimony about judicial accountability. When courts violate constitutional protections, they threaten both individual civil rights and broader democratic institution legitimacy. His framework elevated constitutional compliance from administrative requirement to democratic necessity that federal oversight would ensure through systematic monitoring and community accountability. The Civil Rights and Judicial Accountability Commission, established with authority independent of court administration, included constitutional violation victims, civil rights advocates, legal experts, and federal representatives with power to investigate judicial racism, review court practices, and recommend federal prosecution for systematic violations. Mrs. Rosa Hernandez, whose court observation had documented Patterson's discriminatory patterns, served as community representative, ensuring that reform addressed actual victim experiences rather than judicial preferences or administrative convenience. Constitutional courts must serve civil rights protection and equal treatment rather than institutional racism or judicial bias, Hernandez told the Commission during quarterly reviews. Federal oversight ensures that judicial authority protects rather than violates the constitutional rights of all defendants. Community control over oversight ensured that reform addressed residents' experiences with judicial racism rather than court administrative priorities or federal bureaucratic convenience. Federal judicial constitutional compliance protocols were enhanced nationwide through lessons learned from Riverside, mandatory federal coordination for civil rights protection, automatic federal prosecution when courts demonstrated bias, victim protection programs, and federal funding tied to constitutional compliance rather than case processing statistics. Constitutional adjudication requires judicial systems that serve civil rights protection rather than enabling government racism, Federal Judicial Coordinator explained during national court training. Democratic legitimacy depends on professional, constitutional compliance that protects rather than violates equal protection requirements. Federal oversight included establishment of Judicial Constitutional Violation Victim Services Fund, totaling $89 million distributed among defendants affected by systematic court racism, providing comprehensive support for legal assistance, community healing, psychological counseling, and educational programs addressing institutional discrimination. Marcus Washington Memorial Constitutional Rights Program received federal funding to support minority students pursuing legal education with emphasis on civil rights protection and constitutional compliance, ensuring that future judicial personnel would serve rather than violate community constitutional rights. Education represents long-term institutional change that prevents rather than responds to constitutional violations, program coordinator explained. Professional legal education must emphasize constitutional compliance and civil rights protection, rather than institutional bias and government discrimination tolerance. Reverend Samuel Brooks coordinated interfaith constitutional healing programs addressing spiritual and psychological trauma caused by systematic judicial racism and government constitutional violations. Judicial civil rights abuse creates spiritual trauma affecting entire communities. Federal accountability must include community healing that rebuilds trust in democratic institutions. Religious community leadership provided crucial perspective about institutional healing that addressed moral and spiritual dimensions of systematic constitutional violations and democratic recovery. Federal civil rights enforcement protocols were enhanced based on Riverside experience, systematic monitoring of judicial constitutional compliance, automatic federal investigation triggered by court racism, community reporting systems for constitutional violations, and federal prosecution authority for government civil rights abuse. Civil rights protection requires constitutional judicial systems that defend rather than violate equal protection, Federal Civil Rights Coordinator announced. Constitutional compliance represents democratic necessity when courts must serve rather than abuse constitutional protections. Constitutional law schools established judicial bias prevention programs using Riverside case study to train future judges in constitutional compliance and civil rights protection rather than administrative convenience that might enable systematic discrimination. Judicial education must emphasize constitutional protection rather than institutional bias that threatens democratic legitimacy, Legal Education Coordinator explained during judicial training conferences. Data analysis, 40 months into reform, showed remarkable transformation. Judicial constitutional violations decreased by 97%, minority defendant confidence in court fairness increased by 93%, and legitimate judicial effectiveness improved as constitutional compliance enhanced rather than hindered democratic justice proceedings. Constitutional compliance enhanced rather than compromised legitimate judicial effectiveness, Federal Oversight reported. Professional constitutional adjudication provides better democratic institution integrity than systematic racism, while serving civil rights that strengthen rather than threaten constitutional government. Riverside County's transformation attracted international attention from constitutional law experts and democratic institution scholars who recognized its potential for eliminating judicial racism while maintaining legitimate constitutional protection through professional accountability and civil rights compliance. What happened in Riverside demonstrates that comprehensive federal intervention can eliminate systematic judicial racism while strengthening rather than weakening democratic institutions through constitutional compliance, Brooks told international constitutional conferences. The systematic reform had created permanent federal monitoring, ensuring that judicial constitutional compliance would prevent rather than respond to civil rights violations, protecting future defendants from government racism while ensuring democratic institution integrity through constitutional protection rather than systematic bias. 4 years after Judge Patterson's systematic constitutional violations against District Attorney Brooks, Riverside County had become the national standard for constitutional judicial compliance, demonstrating how comprehensive federal intervention could eliminate systematic racism while strengthening democratic institutions through civil rights, protection and equal treatment under law. The transformation was evident throughout the courthouse complex. Judicial proceedings that had once operated through systematic racism now featured constitutional compliance based on equal protection and civil rights enforcement. The atmosphere of institutional bias and constitutional violations had been replaced by transparent accountability, professional adjudication, and genuine community trust in judicial systems that served rather than violated constitutional principles. District Attorney Brooks returned to Riverside County Superior Court for the dedication of the Constitutional Justice and Civil Rights Protection Center, a permanent reminder of how individual courage in challenging systematic bias could catalyze comprehensive institutional reform that protected democratic institutions while honoring constitutional principles. This Center represents what constitutional judicial systems look like when civil rights, protection and equal treatment are integrated into every aspect of court operations. Brooks announced during the dedication ceremony attended by 800 community members, federal officials and judicial professionals. The comprehensive training facility provided evidence-based judicial education that emphasized constitutional compliance while maintaining effective legal proceedings through professional rather than discriminatory adjudication methods. When courts operate constitutionally, every democratic indicator improves, Brooks explained to visiting judicial officials from other jurisdictions. Case resolution improves because defendants trust rather than fear court proceedings. Constitutional violations decrease through professional accountability, and democratic legitimacy strengthens rather than deteriorates through institutional racism. Chief Judge Chen, whose federal oversight leadership had been crucial for implementing constitutional reform, displayed statistical evidence of transformation that demonstrated comprehensive improvement in both civil rights compliance and legitimate judicial effectiveness. Constitutional compliance enhanced every aspect of judicial operations, Chen told Federal Oversight Delegation. Community confidence increased by 91%, constitutional violation complaints decreased to 0, and judicial legitimacy strengthened, as courts earned rather than demanded public respect through constitutional service. Her leadership of institutional transformation proved that civil rights protection served rather than hindered judicial effectiveness. When implemented through comprehensive federal oversight and community accountability, Mrs. Hernandez, whose documentation had been essential for exposing Patterson's racism, now directed the Community Constitutional Rights Monitoring Project, ensuring that judicial accountability would continue through citizen engagement rather than administrative convenience. Patterson's systematic bias taught us that documenting constitutional violations represents civic duty rather than optional advocacy. Hernandez explained to community groups studying judicial accountability. Constitutional courts must face community oversight when they serve rather than violate the civil rights they are sworn to protect. Her transformation from court observer to constitutional advocate demonstrated how personal experience with judicial racism could be channeled into systematic democratic protection and institutional accountability. The Federal Judicial Constitutional Compliance Office had expanded Riverside's protocols to monitor court constitutional compliance in 247 jurisdictions, using statistical analysis and community feedback to identify systematic racism before it escalated to constitutional violations requiring federal prosecution. Judge Patterson had died by suicide in federal prison after serving 3 years of his 8-year sentence for constitutional violations. His suicide note expressing no remorse for civil rights abuse, but anger about federal prosecution that had destroyed his judicial career. His death was analyzed in judicial ethics training as example of how systematic racism corrupted individual character while threatening democratic institutions. His conviction and imprisonment had established precedent that government officials face serious federal consequences for constitutional violations, regardless of official position or administrative protection. Attorney Jerome Davis had established the National Judicial Constitutional Accountability Project, providing legal representation for communities facing court racism while ensuring systematic federal intervention rather than individual case resolution that ignored broader constitutional compliance. Constitutional violations by government officials represent federal crimes that threaten both individual civil rights and broader democratic legitimacy, Davis explained during constitutional law conferences. Comprehensive federal accountability ensures that judicial authority serves rather than violates constitutional principles. Federal constitutional compliance protocols, developed through Riverside experience, had eliminated systematic judicial racism while enhancing legitimate democratic protection. Professional adjudication standards automatic federal prosecution for government bias, community constitutional monitoring, and institutional accountability for civil rights compliance. Dr. Patricia Martinez, whose oversight had transformed Riverside's judicial system, had become Director of National Judicial Constitutional Reform, using systematic accountability to prevent rather than respond to government constitutional violations. Constitutional compliance represents democratic necessity when courts must serve, rather than abuse civil rights protection. Martinez told federal judicial conferences, institutional accountability serves both individual constitutional protection and broader democratic legitimacy that strengthens constitutional government. As Brooks toured the Constitutional Justice Center that honored individual constitutional courage while celebrating systematic democratic reform, he reflected on how challenging judicial racism had catalyzed comprehensive federal accountability, protecting millions of citizens while strengthening rather than weakening democratic institutions. The courthouse where Patterson had violated constitutional rights now represented national leadership in civil rights, protection and constitutional compliance that served rather than violated democratic principles and equal treatment requirements. Most importantly, Riverside demonstrated that constitutional judicial systems enhanced rather than compromised legal effectiveness, that civil rights protection strengthened rather than weakened democratic institutions, and that systematic reform created fairer communities rather than operational limitations. The district attorney, who had been dismissed as criminal element, now left behind institutions where constitutional protection was guaranteed through federal oversight, where democratic justice was achieved through civil rights compliance, and where judicial authority served rather than violated the constitutional principles that defined American democracy. That transformation from systematic judicial racism to constitutional compliance, from government bias to civil rights protection, from institutional discrimination to democratic accountability, represented the kind of change that made judicial authority serve its constitutional purpose of protecting rather than violating the rights of citizens. It was designed to defend. The undercover investigation that began with systematic constitutional violations had evolved into comprehensive democratic reform that demonstrated how individual integrity could trigger institutional transformation. When backed by federal commitment to constitutional principles and civil rights protection that defended rather than threatened democratic government. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.